Ladies and gentlemen, I'm taking everyone back to 1986, the Janet Jackson Control album. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the background and the making of the Janet Jackson Control album. Control was released on 4 February 1986. Although the album only had 9 songs, 7 singles arose from the album. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis agreed to produce Janet's third album, and their goal was to appeal primarily to the African American community. The album was recorded in Minneapolis, Minnesota at Flight Time Studios, much to the dismay of Joe Jackson, who was Janet's father. Now, there's a lot of stories going on. Janet Jackson, you know the history with Joe Jackson, the Jackson family. He had a very commandeering, devious, devilish spirit about himself. This is not my opinion. This is documented. Their own children even said this. So he wanted total control over Janet's career. Janet was at the point where she was getting older. Her first 2 albums flopped. Hey, I need to go in a different direction. She fired her father, hired another manager, and that manager and her agreed, hey, let's go ahead and record this whole album, the entire album, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Joe Jackson was upset about that because he wanted control over Jackson. No pun intended, control, right? Janet and her new manager said no, because all what's going to happen, you're going to have all your outside influences in there trying to make suggestions about Janet's record. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis stood up for Janet Jackson. They recorded the entire album in Minneapolis, Minnesota for the first time without her father's assistance and or interference. The track listing included smash hits such as Nasty, What Have You Done For Me Lately, Control, Pleasure Principle, to name a few. Hit songs like Nasty and Lately were born out of Janet's encounter with street harassers who was outside of her hotel in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They were making suggestive comments that made Janet uncomfortable. The lyrics to those songs were born out of self-defense. Janet said, talking about the issue, Janet stated she didn't want to try to get help from Jimmy Jam or Terry Lewis. She wanted to combat this issue on her own. Those lyrics from Lately and Nasty were born out of self-defense as a way to not back down. The last song on the album was titled Funny How Time Flies, fitting because there was only 9 songs on the album. You think about that, funny how time flies, 9 songs on the record. The time just flew by. It's a kind of play on words. If you know, you know, right? All right, let's go ahead and dive into nostalgic memories of Janet Jackson's Control. Now, I remember this record came out 1986, the 80s, the mid 80s. Door knocker earrings, big hair, heavy makeup, colorful clothing, all that. The 80s were a magical time. At this time, I was 12 years old when this record came out. And even though that song, the whole album had suggestive lyrics, suggestive connotations and everything, it was an innocence with that song, because a lot of that stuff that Janet was talking about in those songs, we didn't care about none of that. We just like Janet. Janet's, we adored Janet Jackson from her time, not only in the Jackson family, but when she was on Different Strokes and Good Times as well. But to bring it back to the Janet Jackson Control album, that was outside of everything that she talked about on those lyrics, that was an innocent sounding song. The 1980s was one of the greatest eras as it relates to R&B music. It's the innocence. It's certain hymns, it's certain notes, certain bass levels, 808, the electronic music, the horns, everything. It was such a simplistic time as it relates to creating outstanding rhythm and blues soul music. And if you listen to that Janet Jackson record, especially if you're, from my era, even eras older than that, you remember what you were doing during that time. To me, when I hear that Control album, I think about going to the mall. I think about, some of the girls that was playing those records outside, having parties, skating. I mean, those songs were all over the radio. This album only had 9 songs on it, ladies and gentlemen. And out of 9 songs, 7 were hit singles. Think about that. Her first 2 albums flopped like a pancake. Flopped, right? So now third time's the charm. She get Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. You know, those guys work with Prince. Go to Minneapolis, get away from her father and all that nonsense that was going on. And she created an album. All-time great. Janet Jackson's Control album is one of the all-time greatest R&B albums. I don't care if you're black, white, green, purple, whatever. You will have to agree, especially if you lived during that time. If you listen to that record now, you know, if you weren't born in that era, you may not understand what I'm saying, but there was a certain feeling, innocent feeling when you listen to that record, because I described the big hair, the big makeup, the door knocker earrings, and the different color clothing and everything was synonymous, was consistent with that time, mid-80s, 1986. And there were so many incredible records that came out. But I tell you, those are my nostalgic memories, just listening. It's like I can hear that song, and it's like there's a certain smell associated with those songs. You remember what you were doing when those songs came on. And they came on the radio. We listened to it. We made the cassette tapes. We put the little paper inside the tape so we can record it. It was on all the top 10 countdowns, all the video channels, MTV and all that. It was a very simplistic time in music, and it was a beautiful time in music. As a 12-year-old consuming that type of music, you know, you can call it secular, you can call it whatever you want. That was a great freaking album. It is a great album. You could put that Janet Jackson Control album up against a lot of the albums from that era, the 90s, and of course this era. But that time frame, 1986, class personified. The Janet Jackson Control album. Unbelievable. Great record. Hey, thank you guys for tuning in today as we headed down memory lane, talking about another record. Hey, thanks for tuning in, hanging out with me here on the Nomad Cast. Continue to support. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for my new subscribers. Thank you guys for just watching the YouTube shorts and my TikToks and my Instagrams and all that. Hey, just trying to feed the beast. I'm in love with doing these Nomad Casts, these podcasts, whatever you want to call them. And it's all about the stories with me. You know, I've tried to jump here and there on different topics. It all goes back to storytelling. What historical reference, what historical data point can you provide when you're telling these stories? I might tell you a joke, but I ain't going to tell you a lie. Hey, thank you for tuning to the Nomad Cast, where story time is a pastime. I am here to be heard. Trust and believe.